In the heart of London, where tradition stands unshaken and the royal guards never flinch, one brutal punch shattered the silence. A bully, a veteran, and an unbreakable code. What happens when honor demands breaking the very rules sworn to uphold? Witness the moment a royal guard steps out of line and changes everything. The morning sun broke through the overcast London sky, its warm rays illuminating the cobblestone streets around Buckingham Palace. Tourists crowded the area, cameras in hand, eager to capture a glimpse of the iconic royal guards standing stoic at their posts. Street performers entertained along the edges of the crowd, musicians strumming guitars, painters capturing the palace in vibrant strokes, and children laughing as they chased pigeons across the square. A red double-decker bus rumbled past, its horn drowned by the chorus of footsteps and chatter. The air was thick with excitement, a blend of foreign languages filling the space as visitors from around the world gathered to witness the changing of the guard, one of London's most beloved traditions. Among the crowd stood Tom, an elderly man in his late 60s, his figure slightly hunched but still carrying a certain dignified air. He wore a faded olive-green military jacket, adorned with carefully polished metals that glinted under the sun. A simple poppy pin was attached to his lapel, a quiet tribute to the comrades he had lost. His hands, weathered and lined with age, gripped a worn wooden cane, the handle smooth from years of use. His silver hair peeked from beneath a flat cap, and his piercing blue eyes held a lifetime of stories. Tom had served in the military for over 2 decades, dedicating his youth to causes bigger than himself, and now, in his retirement, he often found solace in visiting places where respect for service still lingered. He stood near the towering black gates of the palace, watching the immobile royal guards with admiration. Their discipline reminded him of his younger years, times filled with both pride and pain. His gaze softened as a young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing excitedly at the soldiers, his eyes wide with wonder. Tom smiled to himself, appreciating the innocence that often blurred the harsh realities of the world. But not everyone in the crowd shared that sense of reverence. A loud, mocking laugh broke through the hum of conversation, drawing eyes toward a group of young men leaning against the railing. At the center stood Ryan, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-20s with an arrogant smirk etched permanently on his face. His dark hair was slicked back, and his designer sunglasses perched lazily on his head. Clad in a tight-fitting t-shirt that highlighted his gym-trained muscles, Ryan exuded the kind of confidence that often teetered into cruelty. His friends, 3 equally brash young men, snickered at every joke he made, their laughter loud and pointed. Ryan's gaze swept over the crowd, searching for his next source of entertainment. His eyes landed on Tom, standing quietly by himself, his military jacket catching the sunlight. A slow grin spread across Ryan's face as he nudged his friends. "Oi, look at Grandpa over there," he sneered, his voice loud enough for nearby onlookers to hear. "What's he doing? Think he's still on duty or something?" The group burst into laughter, some of the tourists glancing uncomfortably at the scene unfolding. Tom heard the jeers, but didn't flinch. Years of military service had taught him the power of silence in the face of ignorance. He adjusted his cap and continued watching the guards, refusing to give Ryan the reaction he sought. But Ryan wasn't one to be ignored. "Hey, old man," Ryan called out, his voice dripping with mockery. He swaggered forward, leaving his group behind, and stopped just a few feet from Tom. "What's with the fancy jacket? Playing soldier for the day?" Tom turned his head slightly, meeting Ryan's smug stare with calm, unblinking eyes. "This jacket isn't for play," he replied evenly, his voice low but firm. "It represents 22 years of service to this country." Ryan snorted, waving a dismissive hand. "Yeah? And what did that get you? A cane and some shiny buttons? Congrats, hero." His friends cackled behind him, recording the encounter on their phones, hoping to capture a viral moment. Around them, the crowd grew tense. Some tourists looked away, uncomfortable with the confrontation, while others fumbled with their phones, unsure whether to film or intervene. A young woman whispered to her partner, "Should we call someone?" But her partner shook his head, his eyes fixed on the scene, waiting to see how it would unfold. Tom's grip on his cane tightened, but his face remained composed. "You know," he said, his voice steady, "respect doesn't cost a thing. You might try it sometime." For a fleeting second, Ryan's smirk faltered, but it was quickly replaced by a sneer. Respect? For what? A dusty old man who probably sat behind a desk all wore. He stepped closer, invading Tom's personal space. The air between them grew heavy with unspoken tension. Yet Tom refused to back down. His years on the battlefield had exposed him to horrors far worse than a mouthy bully. He had stared into the eyes of enemies, lost brothers in arms, and carried burdens that would never fully heal. This was nothing. But to Ryan, Tom's composure was infuriating. He thrived on provoking reactions, on breaking people down, and Tom's unshaken demeanor felt like an insult. His hands curled into fists at his sides, his arrogance clouding any sense of decency. The nearby royal guard, standing motionless just feet away, remained in his position, his rifle held firmly at his side. His stoic expression didn't waver, but his eyes, hidden beneath the brim of his bearskin hat, took in every detail. Breaking protocol was unthinkable, but even he felt the mounting tension in the air. As Ryan continued his taunts, the energy in the crowd shifted. People were no longer just spectators. They became witnesses to something darker. And amidst it all, Tom stood tall, a living testament to resilience and dignity, unaware that the day's events were about to spiral into something unforgettable. The atmosphere thickened like a gathering storm. The playful buzz of tourists, once filled with laughter and awe, now dulled under the oppressive weight of Ryan's cruelty. His mocking words hung in the air, sharp and poisonous, cutting through the fragile peace that had once enveloped the square. People shuffled awkwardly, some averting their eyes, others frozen in place, their moral compasses spinning wildly. Should they step in, or would that make things worse? Tom, still rooted where he stood, took a slow breath, feeling the weight of Ryan's gaze on him. Years in combat had taught him how to read a room, how to sense when danger was imminent. And though this wasn't a battlefield, it felt eerily similar. The crowd had become spectators, silent and watchful, like civilians caught in the crossfire of something they couldn't control. Ryan took another step forward, closing the already narrow distance between them. The grin on his face twisted into something darker, something mean-spirited and venomous. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low hiss, meant only for Tom to hear. "What's it like being forgotten, old man? You fight for your country, and now you're just a nobody standing around, hoping someone notices you." Tom clenched his jaw. There was truth in Ryan's words, but it wasn't the kind of truth Ryan understood. Yes, many veterans felt invisible, discarded after giving so much, but Tom had found peace in his solitude. It was the price of survival, a price he had been willing to pay. Yet, hearing it spit out with such disdain sparked a flicker of something deep inside him. "Son," Tom said, his voice calm but edged with warning, "you don't know the first thing about sacrifice." Ryan scoffed, clearly enjoying himself. His friends egged him on from a distance, laughing and recording, their phones aimed directly at Tom, hoping to capture the moment he snapped. But Tom didn't give them that satisfaction. He stood tall, his grip on the cane unshaken, his posture radiating a quiet strength that only made Ryan angrier. "Look at him," Ryan barked to his friends, too scared to even defend himself. But he sat in an office during the war, polishing medals instead of earning them. The insult stung, but Tom remained silent. He knew better than to engage with someone like Ryan, someone who craved a reaction, who fed on weakness. But the crowd was beginning to stir, murmurings of disapproval rippling through the onlookers. A few people shifted forward, as if they might intervene, but none took the final step. That invisible barrier between watching and acting held firm. Near the palace gate, the royal guard continued his stoic stance. His face betrayed nothing, but his jaw clenched tightly beneath the brim of his tall bearskin hat. His training demanded unwavering stillness, a commitment to discipline and duty, but inside, a storm brewed. Guards were not permitted to interfere, no matter the provocation. But this was different. Ryan, emboldened by the lack of intervention, grew bolder. "Come on, old man. Say something. Or are you too weak to even open your mouth?" He jabbed a finger at Tom's chest, the gesture violent enough to make Tom stumble slightly, though he caught himself with his cane. A ripple of gasps echoed through the crowd, but still no one moved. Tom's patience was wearing thin. He had spent decades honing the art of control. On the battlefield, in civilian life, in therapy sessions meant to help him process the horrors of war. But there was only so much a man could take. "I won't hit you, kid," Tom said, his voice low and resolute. "But that doesn't mean you're not doing real damage." Ryan blinked, caught off guard by the statement. For a second, the arrogance slipped, revealing something raw, something human, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Damage," he repeated, laughing harshly. "You're pathetic." Then, with a suddenness that caught even his friends off guard, Ryan shoved Tom hard, sending him stumbling backward. His cane slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground as Tom's body hit the cold cobblestones. A hush fell over the crowd, the only sound being the sharp intake of breath from onlookers. Tom's head struck the ground, a thin trickle of blood trailing from his temple. Ryan stood over him, chest heaving, the adrenaline of the moment clouding any sense of remorse. "Should have stayed home, old man," he muttered. Tom, dazed but conscious, struggled to sit up, one hand reaching instinctively for his fallen cane. His vision blurred, but he could make out the towering figure of the Royal Guard, still in place, still silent. The sense of injustice burned hot inside him, not for himself, but for the symbol of disrespect Ryan had just displayed, not just to him, but to every man and woman who had worn a uniform. The crowd silence broke in a wave of murmurs, some voices shouting for help, others condemning Ryan. But the bully stood tall, his smug expression returning as if the act of knocking down a veteran had somehow elevated him. But then something shifted. The Royal Guard, who had remained motionless through it all, tightened his grip on his rifle. His training screamed at him to hold his position, to remain detached, but the sight of the bloodied veteran stirred something deeper, something stronger than protocol. And for the first time in hours, the stillness was broken. The crowd noticed the subtle movement, the flicker of life in the otherwise statuesque guard, and the realization sent a collective shiver through the onlookers. Ryan, oblivious to the impending storm, turned his back to Tom, raising his arms as if to gloat to the crowd. But the day's events were about to take a turn he could never have predicted. The crowd was eerily silent, breaths held in anticipation, eyes darting between the fallen veteran and the still, towering figure of the Royal Guard. The steady rhythm of London life, usually filled with honking horns, buskers' tunes, and tourist chatter, seemed to come to a halt, like time itself had frozen at the peak of a terrible mistake. Tom lay on the cobblestones, his breathing shallow, blood trickling down his temple in a thin, crimson line that pooled against the stone beneath him. He tried to push himself up, his aged arms trembling with the effort, but his body betrayed him, weakened by both age and the jarring fall. His cane was just out of reach, a cruel symbol of vulnerability in the middle of the bustling square. Around him, the crowd had swelled, faces painted with horror, pity, and confusion. Ryan stood a few feet away, shoulders squared, chest heaving from the adrenaline surge coursing through him. A wide grin stretched across his face, proud of the chaos he had created. His friends, who had been cheering him on just moments before, now shifted nervously, their phones still recording but their hands shaking. It was as if they had crossed an invisible line, and even they weren't sure how to step back. "What?" Ryan barked at the crowd, his arms thrown wide in a challenge. "Everyone's so damn soft these days. It's a joke. He's fine, just a little fall." His voice echoed through the square, filled with forced bravado, but there was a tremor in his words, a crack in his confidence that even he didn't notice. But someone else did. The Royal Guard, still as stone only moments before, moved. It was subtle at first, a slight tightening of his jaw beneath the towering bearskin hat, followed by the almost imperceptible shifting of his feet. But to those watching, it was seismic. The crowd gasped as the guard's hands flexed around his rifle, knuckles white beneath the leather gloves. This was unheard of. Royal guards were known for their stoicism, their unwavering discipline. They didn't flinch, didn't react. But now, the rules seemed to crumble beneath the weight of what had just happened. Tom, still on the ground, blinked through the haze, clouding his vision. He saw the guard's movement through bleary eyes and felt a surge of conflicting emotions, gratitude, concern, and an instinctive understanding of what was about to happen. Ryan, oblivious to the shifting tide, continued to strut in front of the crowd, feeding off the attention. He turned toward the guard, laughing. "Oh, what? Even you gonna break character now? Come on, mate, do something. Or are you just a mannequin with a fancy hat?" The crowd gasped again, this time louder, sharper. Even those who had hesitated moments before now began to murmur, urging Ryan to stop, their voices tinged with panic. But Ryan was too deep in his performance, his ego too inflated to sense the growing danger. That's what happened. With swift, precise movements, the royal guard took one heavy step forward, the steel heel of his black boots slamming into the cobblestones with an authoritative clang. Ryan froze mid-taunt, his smirk faltering for the first time since the encounter began. The guard, now towering over him, let out a sharp, booming command. "Step away." The voice, deep and resonant, echoed off the palace walls, sending a shockwave through the crowd. It was the first time many had ever heard a royal guard speak during duty, and the sound was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Ryan blinked in disbelief, his arrogant mask crumbling under the sheer weight of the command. What? You can't talk. You're not supposed to." Before he could finish his sentence, the guard took another step forward, closing the distance between them. He raised his rifle, not to use it, but to push Ryan backward with the butt, knocking him off balance. Ryan stumbled, arms flailing as he tried to regain his footing, but the guard wasn't done. In a movement so swift it was almost a blur, the guard shifted his stance, pulling his right arm back before sending it forward with brutal force. His gloved fist connected squarely with Ryan's jaw in a thunderous crack that echoed through the square. The impact was so powerful that Ryan's feet left the ground momentarily before his body crumpled onto the cobblestones beside Tom. The crowd erupted, not with fear, but with a mix of shock and cathartic satisfaction. For what felt like hours, they had been forced to witness cruelty unchecked. Now, they had seen justice delivered with surgical precision. Ryan groaned, clutching his jaw, blood pooling at the corner of his mouth. The smug grin was gone, replaced by tears of pain and disbelief. "If you can't hit me," he whimpered, but his voice was weak, fragile. The royal guard loomed over him, still silent. His duty had been clear moments ago. Stand still, maintain decorum, protect the crown. But there was a higher duty at play now, one that transcended protocol. He looked down at Ryan, his face emotionless beneath the tall bearskin hat, before finally breaking the silence. "Disrespect has its price." Tom, still on the ground, coughed softly, pushing himself upright with trembling arms. The guard, noticing, bent down to help him, gently lifting the old veteran to his feet. It was an image that seared itself into the memory of every onlooker. The disciplined soldier, breaking form to offer his hand to a fallen brother in arms. Tom steadied himself, his cane now returned to his grip. He looked up at the guard, his blue eyes filled with both gratitude and understanding. "Thank you," he said softly. The guard nodded once, a subtle but powerful acknowledgement. Ryan, meanwhile, remained sprawled on the ground, his arrogance shattered alongside his pride. His friends had retreated, their phones lowered, unsure whether to help him or flee the scene entirely. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as security and law enforcement closed in on the square. But for a brief moment, time seemed to stretch infinitely. The crowd, the fallen bully, the bleeding veteran, and the stoic guard all suspended in an unforgettable tableau. Justice had been served, not through words or laws, but through an act of raw, necessary defiance. And Ryan, in his arrogance, had learned a lesson that would haunt him far longer than the bruises on his face. The square pulsed with a strange mixture of tension and relief. Moments ago, the scene had been electric with the threat of violence, the air crackling with unspoken questions. Would anyone intervene? Would justice be served? Now, justice had arrived in the most unexpected way, carried out by the very figure sworn to stoicism. The royal guard, who had shattered years of tradition with a single, powerful punch, now stood in the heavy silence that followed. Ryan groaned on the cobblestones, curled into himself, clutching his jaw as blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. The cocky arrogance that had fueled his actions was gone, replaced by pain, humiliation, and a growing realization that he was no longer in control. The crowd, which had been helpless moments ago, now surged with murmured approval. People whispered to each other, some emboldened enough to capture the aftermath on their phones, while others simply stood, stunned by what they'd witnessed. Tom, still trembling, leaned on his cane. His head throbbed from the fall, the blood at his temples sticky and warm, but something inside him, something deeper, felt lighter. He glanced at the royal guard, who now stood in an uncharacteristic pose, not rigid and still, but alive, human, and visibly conflicted. The guard's chest rose and fell with deep, deliberate breaths, as though he was bracing himself for what came next. The sound of sirens grew louder, finally piercing through the heavy quiet. A police van screeched to a halt at the edge of the square, blue lights spinning violently against the stone buildings. Two officers leaped out, their eyes darting between the key players, the bleeding veteran, the crumpled bully, and the imposing figure of the royal guard. "Step back. Everyone, clear the area," one officer shouted, pushing through the crowd as the second officer approached Ryan, who whimpered in pain. "What happened here?" the officer demanded, kneeling beside him. Ryan tried to speak, but winced, his jaw swollen and bruised. He hit me," he managed to croak, pointing a shaking finger at the royal guard. The crowd erupted into scattered protests, voices overlapping in defense of the guard. He was protecting the veteran. That kid shoved the old man first. He deserved it. The officers exchanged a look, understanding the complexity of the scene they had walked into. It wasn't just about a punch. It was about the thin line between duty and humanity, between the expectations of a uniform and the moral compass that beat inside the man wearing it. The lead officer turned to the royal guard, who now stood at attention, rifle in hand, his posture tense but composed. "Sir, we're going to need a statement." For the first time since the incident, the royal guard spoke, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of his actions. "I acted to prevent further harm. The veteran was assaulted. I intervened." The simplicity of the statement belied the turmoil swirling inside him. Every royal guard was drilled with the same doctrine: never break form, never engage. But today he had broken that code, and yet he felt no regret. Tom, leaning heavily on his cane, took a shaky step forward. "He saved me," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "If he hadn't stepped in, I don't know what would have happened." The lead officer studied the veteran, noting the blood on his temple and the visible bruise forming on his cheek. "We'll get you checked out, sir," he replied gently before turning back to the guard. "Protocol says you shouldn't have moved. You know that, right?" The guard nodded once. "Yes, sir. But I also know when protocol fails to protect the people it was designed to serve." A thick silence followed his words, the kind that spoke volumes. The crowd, once a sea of murmurs, now stood in collective respect, the gravity of the moment washing over them. As medics arrived to tend to Tom, another officer cuffed Ryan, who weakly protested but found little sympathy among the onlookers. "You're being detained for assault," the officer announced, his tone flat. Ryan's face crumpled further, not just from the pain, but from the crushing realization that his actions had real consequences. He wasn't the victim here, and the crowd knew it. Meanwhile, the royal guard remained standing, awaiting the inevitable. A senior officer approached, his uniform crisp, his demeanor serious. "You know there will be consequences for this," he said quietly to the guard. "I'm prepared," the guard responded without hesitation. But something in the senior officer's face softened. "You did the right thing," he said, almost under his breath, before stepping back into his official role. The crowd, now realizing the moment was drawing to a close, began to applaud. It started as a slow, tentative ripple, but quickly grew into a wave of claps and cheers. The royal guard didn't flinch, didn't smile, but for the first time, the rigid lines of his face relaxed, even if only for a moment. Tom, now bandaged and upright, walked over to the guard, extending his hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You didn't just protect me. You stood up for what's right." The guard hesitated for only a second before taking the veteran's hand, shaking it firmly. "It was an honor," he replied. As Tom stepped back, he noticed the senior officer speaking quietly to the guard, gesturing toward the palace. There would be reports to file, decisions to be made. The guard had broken protocol, a serious offense, but there was a sense among everyone present that what had happened was bigger than any rulebook. Tom looked around at the crowd, their faces filled with respect and relief. He felt a strange, bittersweet warmth in his chest, not just from being saved, but from seeing that even in a world often ruled by cold rules and heartless onlookers, there were still moments of true courage. As the police escorted Ryan away, and the guard was led back toward the palace for what would surely be a long debrief, Tom stood in the square, his cane in one hand and his head held high. The square returned to life. Tourists, locals, laughter, but something in the air had shifted, a deeper sense of respect lingering in the cobblestones. The royal guard had made a choice, a costly one, but in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that sometimes being human is more important than following the rules. The days that followed the incident rippled with emotion, debate, and introspection. News outlets plastered the footage of the royal guard's intervention across every platform imaginable. Headlines varied. Some praised the guard's bravery, others questioned the breach of protocol. But one thing was consistent. The image of a stoic protector stepping out of his rigid role to defend a vulnerable man resonated deeply with the public. Tom sat by his window, a warm cup of tea cradled in his weathered hands. His bandaged temple was healing, but the deeper wounds, the ones that came from years of feeling invisible, forgotten, were harder to mend. Yet for the first time in a long while, he felt seen, not as a frail old man limping through life, but as someone worth standing up for. The letter in front of him bore the royal seal. It had arrived that morning, delivered with the kind of ceremony he hadn't experienced since his days in the service. Hands trembling, he had opened it, revealing a carefully penned message expressing gratitude for his service and deepest apologies for what he had endured. The words were thoughtful, but it wasn't the letter that had him emotional. It was what came with it. A small medal, the same kind awarded to those who had gone above and beyond in the line of duty, accompanied the note. It was symbolic, yes, but to Tom, it felt like a bridge, a connection between his past and his present, honoring the life he had lived and the sacrifices he had made. His thoughts drifted back to the moment the royal guard intervened. There was something profound about it, about a man sworn to stillness, deciding that action was more important than tradition. It echoed the same code Tom had once lived by in the military. Do what's right, not what's easy. Across town, the royal guard, whose name had since been revealed as William, sat in a stark, formal office inside the palace. A panel of senior officials had been assembled to determine the outcome of his actions. He had been suspended temporarily pending review, though the overwhelming public support had made the decision more complicated than anyone had anticipated. William sat upright, his uniform still impeccable, though the weight of the last few days showed in the lines around his eyes. He had replayed the moment in his head countless times, the split-second decision to step out of line, the feeling of his fist connecting with Ryan's jaw, and the rush of adrenaline that had followed. Yet, despite all the scrutiny and potential consequences, he felt no regret. One of the officials cleared his throat, pulling William from his thoughts. "You understand the severity of breaking protocol?" he asked, though his tone was less accusatory and more curious. "I do," William replied firmly. "And yet, you chose to intervene. Why?" There was a beat of silence before William answered. Because the rules are meant to protect, not to enable harm. That man, Tom, he served this country. He was defenseless. I couldn't stand there and do nothing. The panel exchanged glances, some nodding subtly. The room fell into thoughtful quiet before the lead official leaned forward. The Royal Guard has been a symbol of discipline for centuries. Your actions could have undermined that. Or, William countered gently, they could remind people that beneath the uniform, there's a human being, one who knows right from wrong. The words hung in the air, heavy but true. Outside the palace, crowds had been gathering for days, holding signs of support for William. Real hero, humanity over tradition, and thank you for standing up were just a few of the messages on display. Strangers had left flowers near the barracks, a rare show of public emotion for an institution often shrouded in formality. Tom, watching the coverage from his living room, felt a surge of pride. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about what it represented. People had been so used to walking past guards without a second thought, viewing them as statues rather than people. But now, they saw them differently. In an interview, a historian had said, "This isn't about breaking tradition. It's about evolving it." The Royal Guard has always symbolized protection. Today, we saw that taken to its purest form. For Tom, the incident also forced him to reflect on his own past, on the times he had to make hard decisions in the heat of battle, where the lines between right and wrong weren't always clear. He thought about the comrades he had lost, the moments where stepping out of line had saved lives, and the times when following orders had led to heartbreak, or had taught him that sometimes humanity had to come before hierarchy. He decided to write a letter to William. It was short but heartfelt. "Dear William, you didn't just protect me that day. You reminded me, and everyone watching, of the power of courage. I know what it means to carry the weight of a uniform, to feel bound by rules that sometimes clash with the heart. You made a choice few would dare to make, and for that, I am forever grateful. With deepest respect, Tom." Meanwhile, Ryan, now facing charges for assault, had been released on bail. The media had painted him as the villain he was, and the backlash was fierce. He had lost his job, friends distanced themselves, and his reputation was in tatters. But somewhere in the isolation and shame, there was a flicker of reflection. Sitting in his small apartment, watching the endless coverage, he saw himself not as the victim he had tried to pretend to be, but as the bully who had let his own frustrations turn into cruelty. Whether that flicker would grow into real change was uncertain, but the lesson had been brutal and public. For William, the outcome of the review came days later. The panel had decided not to punish him, but to issue a formal statement acknowledging the complexity of the situation. The statement read, "While tradition holds great value, humanity must guide our actions." Guard William's decision, though against protocol, was in the spirit of protecting the very people we are sworn to serve. Let this moment be a reflection on the balance between duty and compassion. The relief was palpable, but William didn't view it as a victory for himself. It was bigger than that, a shift in how people saw not just the Royal Guard, but the importance of standing up when it mattered most. When Tom and William finally met again, away from the cameras and public eye, it was a simple exchange. Two men from different generations, united by a moment of shared courage. They sat on a park bench, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows on the ground. "I wasn't sure I'd get to thank you properly," Tom said. William smiled softly. "You did the moment you stood up after that fall." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as children played nearby, laughter filling the air. Both men knew that life would move on. The headlines would fade, the debates would quiet, but the lessons would linger. Because in that square, on that day, the world had been reminded of something simple yet profound. Rules guide us, but humanity defines us. The city square where it all happened had transformed. What was once just another cobblestone plaza, lined with tourists and the imposing figures of the Royal Guards, had become something more, a symbol of standing up for what's right, of courage that transcends duty. Weeks had passed since the incident, but the impact lingered, not just in the headlines but in the hearts of those who witnessed it. whether in person or through the countless videos that had gone viral. Tom returned to the square one crisp morning, his cane tapping rhythmically against the stones. He wasn't the same man who had walked here weeks before, battered and vulnerable. There was a spring in his step, subtle but undeniable. His bandages were gone, his face now only marked by a faint bruise, but his spirit, that had healed in a way he hadn't thought possible. Clutched in his hand was a bouquet of poppies, a symbol of remembrance and respect for those who had served. The crowd was thinner than on that fateful day, but the reverence was thick in the air. Tourists still lined up to take pictures, but now there was a quiet acknowledgement, a soft murmur of respect when they passed the spot where the Royal Guard had broken ranks. A small bronze plaque had been installed there overnight, unannounced. It read, "For those who stand not because they are told to, but because it is right." Tom stood before it, his throat tightening. He gently placed the poppies at its base, his fingers lingering on the cool metal. For a moment, memories of his own service washed over him. The brothers he'd lost, the moments of fear, of courage, of humanity that broke through the chaos of war. He never thought he'd feel that kind of solidarity again, but William's simple act had rekindled it. Behind him, there was a familiar tap of polished boots on stone. Tom turned to see William, now in full uniform, his posture just as rigid, but his eyes warmer. There was an unspoken understanding between them. They didn't need grand gestures. Sometimes, respect spoke best in silence. "Morning, sir," William said, his voice softer than protocol usually allowed. Tom chuckled. "No need for the sir. I'm just Tom." William smiled. "To me, you'll always be more than that." They stood side by side, gazing at the plaque. The sun broke through the morning clouds, casting long shadows, almost as if connecting them. Two figures, both molded by service, by sacrifice, but bound now by something deeper. The city had changed too. The incident had sparked a wider conversation about how society treated its veterans, the forgotten heroes who often faded into the background of everyday life. Donations to veteran support organizations had surged, spurred by the public outcry. Parliament had even begun discussions about implementing new programs to assist aging veterans, ensuring they had access to proper housing, health care, and mental health services. But it wasn't just policy that shifted. It was people. Tourists who once bustled past the Royal Guards without a second glance now paused, offering small nods of respect. Some even brought their children, explaining the importance of what had happened. This is where the Guards stood up for someone. They'd say, teaching the next generation that courage isn't about following orders blindly. It's about knowing when to step beyond them. William's life had changed too. Though the panel had decided not to punish him, there had been talks within the Guard about revisiting the rigidity of their rules. He'd been approached by senior officials about joining a new training program focused on situational judgment, teaching new recruits that duty didn't mean sacrificing humanity. One afternoon, weeks after the incident, William found himself back at the barracks, standing before a group of fresh-faced recruits. Their uniforms still creased from their first fittings, their eyes wide with both excitement and nerves. William cleared his throat. "When I first joined the Royal Guard," he began, "I thought duty was everything. Standing still, following orders, not questioning the rules." He paused, searching their faces. "But then I realized our duty isn't just to the crown. It's to the people, to protect, to serve. And sometimes that means making hard choices." The recruits listened intently, their backs straight, but their expressions thoughtful. One of them, a young woman with dark hair tucked neatly under her hat, raised her hand. "Sir, were you scared when you stepped out of line?" William thought about it. "I wasn't scared of breaking the rules. I was scared of what would happen if I didn't." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling deep. Meanwhile, Tom had found a renewed sense of purpose. The public attention had given him a platform, a voice that had been dormant for years. Local schools invited him to speak to students about his time in the service, not just about the horrors of war, but about brotherhood, sacrifice, and resilience. He spoke not as a victim of an attack, but as a survivor, a veteran, and most importantly, as someone who had learned the value of compassion in unexpected moments. One particular school visit stood out. A boy, no older than 10, approached Tom after his talk. "Mister, were you scared when that man hit you?" Tom knelt slightly, lowering himself to the boy's level. "I was, but then someone stood up for me, and I wasn't scared anymore." The boy's eyes sparkled. "I want to be brave like that guard one day." Tom smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "You already are, just for wanting to." The incident hadn't just changed Tom and William. It had rippled outward, touching strangers they'd never meet, instilling a simple but powerful lesson. Standing up for others isn't just brave, it's necessary. In the end, the city returned to its rhythms, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. There was more kindness in the small moments. A stranger helping an elderly person cross the street, a young couple stopping to chat with a homeless veteran, even the guards allowing themselves the rarest of gestures, a brief smile. On the anniversary of the incident, Tom and William met again at the square. The plaque now gleamed under the sun, its edges worn from the countless hands that had touched it over the year. Flowers surrounded its base, left by strangers who understood its significance. They didn't speak much that day. They didn't need to. They simply stood side by side, a veteran and a guard, bound not by duty or obligation, but by respect, earned, not given. As the bells of a nearby church chimed the hour, Tom glanced at William. "You know," he began, "I used to think the bravest thing a man could do was follow orders." William raised an eyebrow. "And now?" Tom smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Now I know. It's knowing when not to." The guard chuckled softly, nodding in agreement. And with that, they stood in silence, the world moving around them. But for a moment, it all felt still, balanced between tradition and humanity, bound by a newfound respect that would echo long after they were gone. Sometimes, it takes just one act of courage to remind us all what standing up for others truly means. What would you have done in that moment? Have you ever witnessed someone step up when it mattered most? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Let's celebrate the everyday heroes among us.